Hello! Read it here. Today we're going to read a story from our /pro revenge. Now, for our first story, a lawyer's pro revenge on a landlord. Landlords are assholes, generally speaking. Everyone knows that. But if you think residential landlords are bad, they're nothing compared to commercial landlords. Landlords of commercial buildings are some of the cruelest, nastiest people I've ever come across. This revenge tale is about a commercial landlord and how I dealt with him. Back in the 90s, sometimes I'd go for lunch at this restaurant in the basement of our building. The place was called The Vault because it had a massive bank vault that had always been there, dating back to the days before the place was turned into a restaurant. The vault was so huge that they could seat a couple of tables in there, and you could eat dinner surrounded by rows of old, gleaming safe deposit boxes. One day I was there for lunch, and the owner took me aside. "The landlord's driving me nuts," he said. "The landlord drives everyone nuts," I said. I was a subtenant in the same building, sharing space with an older lawyer, Aaron, and the landlord was always causing us trouble. I'd already had a few run-ins with him, and we hated each other on sight. In most jurisdictions, commercial landlords don't need court orders to get you out if you're late with the rent. Instead, they just change the locks, and you find out about it when you show up and your key doesn't work. Every time our landlord had a dispute with anyone, which was often, he'd always threaten to change the locks. "He keeps demanding all this stuff for extra rent," the vault's owner said, "and it's really weird because a lot of it's really old." The restaurant owner showed me a letter the landlord had served on him earlier that day. I looked over the demand and read a list of expenses for snow removal and parking lot repair and common area flooring and all kinds of crap going back years. I read it all the way to the end, and there was the usual clause saying he was going to change the locks if the tenant didn't pay this and do that. From the wording of the demand, it looks like you've been fighting a while. Why did you wait before consulting a lawyer? I asked one of the lawyers I know, and he said it's hopeless. He told me the lawyer's name. It was a guy I knew with a shitty real estate practice, who'd resorted to taking little legal aid cases to keep the lights on when the market tanked in '89. "You do something to make the landlord hate you?" I asked, because this is a bit over the top, even for our asshole landlord. "He knows I'm moving the restaurant. I think he's trying to grab as much money as possible before I go. Plus, he's giving me grief over the vault. He won't let you take it with you? Are you kidding? It weighs almost 100 tons, and I don't need it. But the lease says I have to remove it, and that I also have to restore the building to what it was before there was a vault. That would cost a fortune. The asshole landlord says if I leave the vault behind when I move, he'll sue. Send your lease up to my office, and let me look it over," I said. I finished my lunch, and when I got back to my office, the lease was waiting for me. It was just as bad as the restaurant owner said. The lease was a renewal of an assignment of a renewal. The original documents dating back to the shortly after WW2 when a bank first leased the place and the vault was installed. Somehow the landlord had suckered the restaurant into taking over a lease that left him liable to remove a bank vault at the end of term. No big deal, I thought. The restaurant can default, and all the landlord can do is sue a shell company. But when I got to the last page of the lease, there was a guarantee clause. The restaurant owner had personally guaranteed the lease, and he was on the hook for removing a vault weighing 100 tons and then fixing the place up. It would cost a fortune. The case was hopeless, of course. That was obvious right away. But then I thought about the asshole landlord with his demands and his threats and his rent hikes, and I asked my brain to do me a solid, which it promptly did. I picked up the phone and called the restaurant owner. "I'm fucked, right?" he said. "You're calling me to say there's no way out." That's what my commercial lawyer already said. But I just thought I'd ask. "I can save you, but it's going to cost." "How much?" $5,000 in legals and another G note for the agent. "Agent? What kind of agent?" "Real estate. Send up a check, certified, and leave the rest to me." The check at my desk in less than an hour. I went to Aaron's office. "I need a real estate agent," I said. "You buying a house?" "No." "Selling a house?" "No." By this point, I'd been sharing space with Aaron for almost 5 years, and he knew me pretty well. "You pulling one of your stunts again?" he asked. "Yup, but nothing that will get you into trouble." "I know a guy," he said. Aaron knew all kinds of guys, and that's one of the reasons he eventually got disbarred. But he knew a guy, and he gave me the agent's name and number, and the next day, I paid the agent a visit. I told him what I needed, and we agreed to terms. I gave him some papers and the cash for his fee. A few days later, I was again at the vault for lunch. The owner saw me walk in and greeted me himself. "The landlord's here," he said. "Why?" "For lunch and to be an asshole. Let's sit in the vault room so I don't have to look at his face." He took me to the vault room, and with the door almost completely closed, we had a consultation while we ate pasta and drank red wine. "We're making demand on the landlord," I said between bites of a perfect carbonara. "Demand? What are we demanding?" I pulled a document out of my briefcase and passed it to him while I sipped my wine. "We're demanding that the asshole landlord release all the restaurant equipment, all the fixtures, the ovens, the freezers, the ventilation, everything you need to run a restaurant. The lease exempts all that stuff," the restaurant guy told me. "He can't stop me taking what I want. The only thing that matters is the vault, and of course I don't want that." I shook my head. "You need the vault," I said, "and we're demanding that he release the bank vault as well. We're insisting that he let you take it out within 7 business days. You think you can beat the landlord with reverse psychology? You think if you treat him like a 2-year-old, you can manipulate him into doing what you want? We'll find out soon enough. He's had the demand for a couple of days now." The restaurant owner dropped his wine glass, and it shattered on the marble floor. "You already gave it to him?" the restaurant owner said. He got up, swung open the vault door, and called for the waiter to clean up the mess. "Let's see what the landlord has to say," I told him, and we walked over to the landlord's table. The landlord was a big, beefy man with a big appetite. He sat alone, eating a rack of lamb wolfishly with his hands. "My client needs an answer today," I said. The landlord looked up at me as he chewed noisily. "I'm the vault's lawyer," I said. "I gave you a demand the other day. My client needs an answer right now. He needs the vault for a new place, and he's got to make arrangements." "Your client can forget about the bank vault," he said, wiping his massive, greasy hands on an already soiled napkin. "But you can't do that," I said. My shock was feigned, but the restaurant owner's jaw dropped for real. The landlord laughed at us. "I'm the landlord. I can do what I want. I'm going to need that in writing, because my client might sue." I said, "Sue all you like." The landlord told me, "Sue till you're blue in the face." He told me that I'd have a formal response by day's end, and then he told me to go away and let him finish his lunch. When the letter arrived from the landlord claiming ownership over the bank vault, I brought it downstairs and showed it to my client. "How the hell did you do that?" "Trade secret," I said. The following month, the restaurant moved out, and the place was empty, and that was too bad, because I had always liked eating at the vault. Now the restaurant was in a new location 20 minutes away. They called the new place the Vault, and they'd preserved the vibe of the old place. It was very similar, except they didn't have the bank vault. The bank vault, all 100 tons of it, was where it had always been, in the basement of the building where I rented space. I showed up for work a little after that, and Aaron collared me. "The landlord's looking for you," he said. "Oh yeah? What about?" "He's really angry. He said his deal fell through." "Deal?" "He was supposed to rent the place downstairs to a new tenant, a bank or a credit union or something like that. They were supposed to come in to sign a lease, but they didn't show up. And what's that got to do with me?" I said to Aaron, and I said the same thing again to the landlord when he managed to track me down a couple of days later. "I know you were behind this," he said, his jowls quivering. "I know it was you. That offer from the agent, it was all bullshit. Just a trick to make me keep the vault so that your client could sneak out of the place and leave that fucking bank vault behind. I'm going to sue. If you're looking for counsel, I think I'm going to have to declare a conflict. I'm going to sue the restaurant and that agent, and I'm going to sue you." He stormed off, but the landlord didn't sue. Of course he didn't. He didn't have a contract to sue on, only a vague letter of intent that I drafted, enough to hook a greedy landlord who was used to having his way. The offer he'd received was non-binding, incapable of acceptance without the signing of a formal lease, which of course never got signed. When I left Aaron's place a year later, the downstairs was still unoccupied, with a sad for rent sign sitting in the window, starting to look faded. Let's hear from the comment section. Comment 1. "Oh, this story makes me very happy. Made me want to don a fedora and smoke a cigarette under a streetlight in the rain. And recall the time I was slipped a Mickey Finn some sweet-cheeked woman who knew the score whilst I tailing the fat man." Comment 2. "This feels like the first episode to a lawyer show. Something between Better Call Saul and Franklin and Bash." In my mind, Mark PG plays you. Comment 3. I work for an attorney who is also a business broker, and this is exactly the kind of service he's known for. For his clients, he will dance right on the edge without ever going over. Comment 4. I am not saying all landlords are bad, but there's no point writing about nice landlords. Nice landlords are boring. So I wrote a story about a mean landlord who owned a building in the city of Bixity, the place where I practice law. Bixity is in Canada, the land of free healthcare, the NDP, and the occasional union here and there. But despite the slightly left-wing slant up here, Canada is a capitalist country, and in capitalist countries, property rights are king. In Canada, the courts will bend over backwards to protect property rights. In Bixity, like in most common law jurisdictions, a lease will often deem certain expenses to be part of the rent. Extra rent, the lease calls it. And under that category, your typical landlord will add every expense he can think of, from carpet cleaning to garbage collecting to snow removal, plus often a 10% markup, just because. Follow along with me for a moment here, and put yourself in the place of a tenant. You're a good tenant, an honest tenant, and you've never missed a rent payment, and you've been there for years. Then one day the landlord shoves a big bill in your face for extra rent, and your finances are thrown for a loop. Sure, you can ask what's the extra rent is for, and why is it so much, and you can go to court about it if you want and maybe win. But meanwhile, you have to pay, because all those extra expenses, real or invented, become part of the rent the moment the landlord shoves the invoice in your face. And if you don't pay, the landlord can change the locks. So you pay first and fight later. The law gives you no choice. So that's what the story is about, the extra rent thing and the weight the law puts behind it. It's nice when a tenant manages to escape now and again. Now, for our second story. We reverse gazumped a greedy landlord, and it was glorious. Gazumping occurs when an agent or seller accepts an offer you make to buy a property at an agreed price, but the property is sold to someone else. This usually happens when the vendor sells the property for a higher amount. This happened 15 years ago, and it is one of the proudest moments of my life. My best friend and her husband have 5 kids together. They lived in an expensive city and rented an old 4-bedroom house for $400 per week. The house was very run down with a disgusting kitchen and stink drains, but it was all they could afford at the time. Still, they made it work. The owner was a nice old lady who was extremely wealthy and very fond of my friend. She froze the rent for 5 years and promised to let them buy the house once they had saved enough to get a loan from the bank. As she had helped other people in a similar way, they knew they could trust her, and so they saved every cent they could. It took them 5 years, but they finally told her they were ready. 2 days later, the nice old lady passed away before anything was put in writing. Enter the new owners, the lady's 4 children, each extremely wealthy in their own right. They inherited a huge portfolio of properties. When they first spoke to my friends, they assured them that the sale would still go through, but they would have to wait until probate had settled. Confident, my friends started making some changes to the place. They started by stripping wallpaper, painting, and making plans. Finally, probate was settled, and the owners agreed to go ahead with the sale for the previously agreed price. My friends applied for the loan, but to their shock, it was refused. The owners had raised the asking price by $80,000 without telling my friends. To make things even worse, the house would be put on the open market. In 7 days, there would be an open house, and with the market the way it was, it would probably sell immediately. My friends were devastated. They might be able to borrow enough, but it would take longer than a week to get. To make matters worse, property prices had soared recently, and rents had gone up a lot whilst theirs had been frozen. Not only were my friends going to struggle to get the money, if the place was sold to someone else and they were asked for a higher rent or were evicted, it would be nearly impossible to find an affordable place with more than 2 bedrooms. I was scared for my friends, but I was also incandescently angry. Those greedy sods were some of the wealthiest people in the city. They were screwing over a struggling family for less than $20,000 each. They didn't need the money. It is pure greed, and it was obvious that they'd always planned to do this. So while my friends scrambled to come up with the money, I started plotting. I looked up advice on what helps to make a sale. We needed to make the place as undesirable as possible without making my friends look like bad tenants. Uncluttered. We moved all the furniture in from the walls, added some extra furniture and borrowed ornaments, and hung a load of motorcycle memorabilia on the walls. The place felt more smaller. Smell. My friend boiled a head of cabbage on the stove, and we sprayed ammonia around the front and back doors because it smells like all the neighborhood cats have been marking their territory. We also poured 24 rotten eggs down the drain to make it smell like sewer gas. Neighborhood. We obtained a moldy old couch and dumped in front yard of the neighbor across the road, with permission of course. Neighborhood X2. We started calling friends for help. Anybody with a loud and crappy car was asked to do a few laps in front of the block during the open day. The street was unusually busy that day. Everyone we knew found a reason to drive by. It was practically rush hour. Neighborhood X3. We called out mates from the rugby club, full contact football without any of that soft padding. A big portion of our club are very large men. The next door neighbors set up a barbecue in their front yard, and we offered free food and cheap beer. They came on motorcycles wearing their roughest gear. There was quite a crowd. A lot of people showed up for the open day. Quite a few were in and out within minutes. One lady sat in her car and watched the party next door before driving away. The one bloke who stayed any length time was brave enough to start up a conversation with someone leaving the party. He asked if they were often there and was told every couple of weeks or so. They have an after-party morning, and the party the night before was 3 doors up. The partygoer also helpfully mentioned the troublesome drains that are always getting blocked by tree roots and stinking up the place. The potential buyer left without making an offer. So my friends were the only ones to make an offer. They still had to pay more than they'd planned, but not as much as the greed bastards wanted. My friend signed the papers and paid the deposit that day. So when the brave buyer put in an offer of $30,000 more than my friends, there was nothing the owners could do about it. Strict anti-gazumping laws. I would have loved to see the owners' faces when they found out. For all the people who were saying they had cheap rent, they didn't. $400 was the rent in 2004, and that was pretty high back then. By the time the lady died, average rent for a house that size had only gone up by about $40. Nowadays, 4-bedroom houses in that area go for approximately $800 per week. Let's hear from the comment section. Comment 1. It does sound very Australian. It's weird, as a Brit, to see the occupant of one former British colonial outpost tell an occupant of a different British colonial outpost that a British word does sound very much like a word that would belong to that former British colonial outpost, rather than the mother nation that gave birth to both. Comment 2. I was wondering the entire time because I had never heard of a home sales process like this. Gazumping is a great word, BTW. In America, you have 30 to 45 days to secure a loan after making an offer. Although also, the seller doesn't have to honor an open house. They can just decide not to sell or to wait for a better bid. It seems crazy to me that houses are sold this way in Australia when prices are so astronomical there. That has to be so stressful. Comment 3. Reminds me of when banks or corporations would reclaim a struggling family's farm and put it up for auction. The whole town of farmers would turn up, and the original owner would bid for a penny while everyone else just there silently or bullied the other people bidding into dropping their bid. The farm would go back to the owner. Collective solidarity wins again. Comment 4. I'm also Australian, and I'll take a stab at it based on my experience. I rented from an extended family member who moved overseas. We were close, and he wasn't greedy. We had an agreement that I'd buy directly from him once I had the money. I'm not selfish, so I always intended to buy at market value. The issue arose from mortgage insurance. I only barely qualified for a $250,000 loan, but I need to pay mortgage insurance for a few years until my LVR improved. The place was offered to me at $225K, so the total loan was smaller than my pre-approval. However, the insurance assessor said he couldn't value it above $210K, so I couldn't buy it at a fair price. So it went to auction and was bought for $245K. 2 years later, it sold for $350K. Something like that might have happened here. A difference in opinion between agreed value and assessed value. And yes, Aussies reading this can probably guess this happened way back at the beginning of the housing shortage, when banks were still acting responsibly and a single guy in his early 20s could get a loan for a 2-bedroom apartment. Now, for our third story. Not going to pay overtime? Think again. Don't mess with the IT guy. I was discussing this sub with a good friend. and he said, "Boy, have I got a story that'll fit." It wasn't his story, but his brother's, and I sat with him and got the details. Buckle up, it's a good one and a long one. Let's call him Bob. Bob has been fiddling with computers since he was a kid and knows them pretty well. As with most IT people, he's moved from job to job. The employer he worked for was a service/distribution company, and there were 2 IT employees. The company was located in Ontario, Canada. About 3 years ago, Bob's employer decided to modernize their software. They had separate programs for dispatching, for inventory, for payroll and finances, and it was complicated moving information from one program to the other. They decided to get an ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, program, and Bob recommended one that he knew inside out from a previous employer. For those of you who don't know, an ERP program handles everything. Purchase orders, sales, inventory, personnel, vendors, customers, all of it. You can run a report and find out which customer has bought the most part ABC in the last year, which salesman has improved his numbers the most, which vendor has the fastest delivery time, which shipper packed the most orders. Everyone in the company used the ERP program, but it was very complicated and they used the aspects of it that related to their position. For example, the receiver would accept a shipment, verify the quantity, confirm it was received, and the inventory stats would be available to the salespeople if they wanted to look up how many were on hand. The receiver didn't care what the price was or who the vendor was. He just did his job. Bob was run ragged during the implementation process, but he managed to train most of the employees on their aspects, and after a few months, everything was running fairly smoothly. Bob still got tickets for tweaks in the operation of the software and occasional hardware IT issues. Then the company decided to expand their footprint and was marketing into different time zones. That messed things up. Atlanta, Canada is 90 minutes early, so if someone sent an email or an order at 8 a.m. their time, it would arrive at 6:30 a.m. Ontario time. Pacific Canada is 3 hours late, so an email sent at 3 p.m. Vancouver time would arrive at 6 p.m. This stretched out the day. So many staff came in early and worked late. Bob would arrive at 8 a.m., and there would be people that demanded his immediate assistance and were annoyed that he didn't respond instantly, even though their request was submitted before his start time. Same with late in the day. His phone would ring at dinner time with people that wanted help right now. They decided to stagger his and his IT colleagues' shift times. Bob would start at 6 a.m. and work till 2:30, and his colleague would start at 10:30 a.m. and work till 7 p.m. Bob's colleague had kids and refused the shift change. The employer insisted. The colleague quit. That meant that Bob was the only person in the IT department. The employer said they would look to hire a new IT guy, but they had trouble finding one that knew the ERP system, and they were offering well under a market value salary. Bob asked for a raise and was denied. Then he wanted overtime, and the employer told him that as an IT specialist, he was exempt from overtime laws in Ontario. Bob looked it up, and the employer was correct. This went on for some time, and he knew lots of IT people socially. They told him what the company was offering, and Bob knew that they wouldn't find another tech. Things went downhill from there. Bob would get chewed out if he missed a call or an email, no matter what time it came in. He had to train new hires in the ERP system, as well as take care of the hardware. He asked repeatedly for better compensation and was denied, so he planned to get a new job. Now here's the revenge. Bob had access to the entirety of the ERP program. When a user signed in, the time was logged, and even if they didn't sign out, after 15 minutes it would log them out anyway. Everyone in the company was on salary, and many of them came in early and stayed late. Ontario labor law states that even salaried workers are entitled to overtime after 44 hours a week, unless they were managers or supervisors. So Bob jumped into the program and ran a report for each employee that wasn't a manager, all the way back to when the ERP program was started. Then he reached out to an employment lawyer and got the okay to refer employees to him. Bob lined up another job, and after he left, every employee in the company got an email with an Excel sheet showing the hours they had put in past 44 hours a week. The subject line said, "You're legally entitled to overtime pay." In the body of the email was the lawyer's name. The shit hit the fan. Almost every employee authorized the lawyer to negotiate with the company on their behalf, and the company had to pay a ton of money. All the company had to do was pay Bob for the extra work he put in. Instead, they had to pay almost everyone. Let's hear from the comment section. Comment 1. At least one of the big 4 accounting firms in my area hires new grads with the expectation of working at least 60 hours per week during tax season with no overtime or bank time. And the only people who put up with it are the newbies and those who still think they can make it into the upper ranks. The just burnout newbies left and right along the way. I worked for a sweatshop like that. I finally just said screw it and stopped. They were a very ugly company and still are. They called themselves MCI at the time and are Horizon with AV now. They are just as terrible to their customers. Comment 2. Oh man, I worked for another company on behalf of those folks about 10 years ago. Call center, mixed tech support, and customer service. They had mandatory overtime, and when they lowered our overall pay, while increasing the cap on bonuses for people who performed extra well, they expected us to thank them for giving us a raise. Utterly awful company. Comment 3. I would assume that being exempt from overtime means you work on average a certain number of hours. If it's structurally over those hours, you don't work it or get paid for it. If it's anything other than that, it's crazy. From my understanding, it's supposed to be that what companies like to bend the rules with it. Just like how certain jobs don't have a preset break and lunch schedule that's supposed to be for jobs that you can't just take a 15-minute break in, like being a fucking doctor. Not fucking kitchen work like they seem to think they are allowed to do. Comment 5. I had a similar situation happen at a previous employer. I worked 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. and would occasionally be late by less than 10 minutes. I almost always worked after 7 p.m., finishing up calls and admin stuff before I left. Because of this, I always just listed 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. on my time card because in my head it evened itself out. Then the company decided we needed to be very specific with our beginning and end times on our timesheets. I ended up about $100 short one paycheck and asked my manager about it. She said she'd adjusted my timesheet to reflect the actual time I arrived, and I hadn't worked a full 80 hours that pay period. I brought up the fact that she had not adjusted my timesheet to reflect the actual time I logged off. She'd just left it at 7 p.m., so my pay was not accurate, and I'd actually worked more than 80 hours. She kind of shrugged it off and didn't really do anything to correct it. From that point until I quit a year later, I was meticulous with my timekeeping. My arrival, breaks, lunch, and clock out were noted to the minute. Turns out I was actually working 5 to 6 hours of overtime every pay period, even with the occasional late arrival. Don't fuck with my money. Now, for our 4th story. Phone calls for the previous owner, who turned out to be my shitty manager. Mobile phones became common in my country around 2004, just as I finished high school. My parents bought me my first phone, a secondhand Nokia. It was bulky and basic, but I promised myself that someday I'd buy a new phone with my own money. When college started, I had a 2-hour daily commute. In high school, I had excelled academically and won several district-level awards. These awards were being distributed during my first year of college. One nationalized bank award finally gave me enough money for a new phone. I bought a Sony Ericsson K300i and a premium SIM card, not realizing it had been abandoned by its previous owner. By the 3rd day, I started receiving calls for a guy named Bitsa from various financial institutions. It turned out the number previously belonged to him, and for 20 years I've been getting these calls. Determined to keep my premium number, I began a routine of blocking wrong numbers. Back then, blocking was device-specific, so each time I got a new phone, I had to start over, keeping a list of numbers to block. I got my first job after graduating in 2009. Around 2010, I was assigned to a new project with a notorious reputation for burning people out due to a nefarious project manager named Bits. I didn't know his full name for quite a while. He took pride in making our lives a living hell. Bits ruled with an iron fist. From the moment his team stepped into the office, they were met with a barrage of emails and messages, each more urgent than the last. Bits thrived on creating chaos, often changing project deadlines on a whim, demanding his team work late into the night and through weekends. Bits' presence loomed over every task. He insisted on micromanaging every detail, yet was quick to take credit for any successes, no matter how small. Failures, however, were met with his notorious tirades, publicly berating his team and assigning blame without hesitation. His unpredictable temper kept everyone on edge, afraid to make the slightest mistake. Meetings were another tool in his arsenal of torment. He scheduled them during lunch breaks and after hours, ensuring no one could escape his grasp. These meetings were often pointless, serving only to reinforce his dominance and disrupt any semblance of work-life balance his team might have had. His relentless stream of emails continued around the clock, each carrying a thinly veiled threat, perfection or dismissal. Under his reign, morale plummeted and burnout soared. Yet Bitz remained oblivious, satisfied only by his complete and total control. I was quite ashamed when I learned that he was from the same area as I was and had gone to the same school, though years before me. In 2012, our company merged with a parent company. Almost nothing changed personnel-wise, but infrastructure-wise we got MS Outlook and an organization view. That was when I first learned about Bitz from an organizational hierarchy perspective. His full name was an eye-opener. It was Bitsa. Now, the name was common enough, but at the time, mobile numbers had an area-specific pattern, so I already knew that the previous owner of my number was from the same area as me. Still, it could be someone else. I wanted to dig deeper. I talked with an old mentor who lived in the same area and had coached several high school students for the last 2 decades. He confirmed my suspicions. I won't go into the details, but it was evident that Bitsa and Bitz were the same person. I had been quite pissed with this unknown person named Bitsa for almost a decade by then, and Bitz had been the bane of my, and several others, existence for quite some time. This is where the revenge lies. First, I unblocked all the numbers in my phone. I was getting 5 to 6 calls daily on average, but after unblocking about 150 numbers, it increased to 15 to 18. My answering strategy changed drastically. Instead of saying wrong number, I politely explained that the owner had changed his number and provided his current number to update their database. This is where I could be the AH. I also volunteered his manager's number in case he tries something else. The fallout was epic. These people had been trying to find him for almost a decade. Banks had sold his debts to companies that harass people for a living to get their money back. It turned out he had been taking loans in everyone's names, his wife, parents, uncles, aunts, and giving everyone that same number. He was evading credit card debt and loans of upwards of $200,000, equivalent in USD, but it's a shitload of money where we are from. Apparently, he had almost 20 cases filed against him, but no one could find him. Probably why he thought he could walk on water. There are multiple versions of what happened at the office when his manager started to get calls about him. He was let go about 2 months later, haven't heard from him since. TLDR. Previous owner of my number had duped several financial institutions. He later turned out to be my shitty boss. I informed the banks of his new number and his manager's number, leaving his career in shambles. Let's hear from the comment section. Comment 1. Credit card debt and loans of upwards of $200,000, equivalent in USD, but it's a shitload of money where we are from. That's a shitload of money where everybody's from. Comment 2. I have done this to my tormentor. For years, I have been getting calls for home loans, car insurance, you name it. Anytime Richard, his real name, wants a quote, he uses my number. I think it's to get a quote without the callback hassle. It took a while, but I was able to glean enough info to find the bastard. And yes, I did confirm it was him. Now when I get a robocall, I answer it. I just say, hello. They ask for Richard. I found if I say this is a wrong number, they will immediately hang up. But if I say, let me get you Richard's correct number, they're happy to update their records. I also double-check the bastard's number whenever he gets new quotes. They come in cycles. I don't want to torment another innocent person. Fuck you, Richard. Please excuse formatting or spelling. Stuck at O'Hare, ping on a phone, drinking double jacks. Comment 3. The revenge itself was fantastic to read, but I also really wanted to compliment you on your writing. It is so refreshing to read a long Reddit post with proper paragraphs written by someone who understands how to use the English language. It made me cry happy tears and confirmed that the reason I abandoned most long posts halfway through is not my lack of concentration or ability to process information. I was so afraid it was this, but rather poor grammar and bad euphemisms that hurt my brain. Yours was a breeze to read, and I thank you for it, friend. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see more.